Welcome, fellow aviators, and welcome back to part 4 in this series. My name is Greg, and today's video will cover the landing pattern. This is my home airfield with a typical landing pattern overlaid on top. North is at the top of the screen, and I added the runway numbers. The usual 90-degree turns to crosswind, downwind, base, and final are combined into two continuous 180-degree turns. Two turns on base or crosswind are impractical with a fast-moving jet. The downwind leg would have to be so far away it would be hard to see the plane. A single turn simplifies the pattern and brings the downwind leg closer to the runway. For the Avanti, I found an offset of about 500 feet. Works well to keep the bank angle reasonable in the turn. The typical departure leg is not shown here, but I highly recommend making use of it for takeoffs rather than making an immediate turn. The reason for that is to allow time to retract the landing gear. Making an immediate turn as the plane accelerates puts a large G-load on the retract system. The prevailing wind here is westerly, but occasionally we have an easterly wind. That means getting reacquainted with the landmarks for a left-hand pattern to runway 6 instead of the usual right-hand pattern to 24. These runway numbers are based on true north headings of 064.5 and 244.5, rounded to the nearest 10 degrees. Full-scale runway headings are based on magnetic north. The magnetic declination at our airfield is 5.83 degrees west. So the runway numbers actually have magnetic bearings very close to 070 and 250. So why show true rather than magnetic bearings? And why does this matter? The short answer is it doesn't. This is a hobby. Lives aren't at stake, and often close enough counts. I just don't subscribe to the extreme view, like some, that every plane we fly in this hobby is a toy and nothing should be taken seriously. Like any hobby with lots of moving parts and many facets, some areas need more attention than others. Just as there are builders and flyers, different aspects are intriguing to different people. You can have as much fun, if not more, with a $100 foam plane as others can with a turbine jet that costs thousands. But the turbine will require more responsibility and attention to detail to protect people and property. Numbers can provide a measure of safety and a little more objectivity to the hobby. Okay, back to runway numbers. I like to report which runway I'm using when the winds play a significant role. It's often hard to tell wind direction or strength in a video, yet it can adversely affect the quality of flight, especially the landing. Whether the wind is strong or light, smooth or bumpy, aligned with the runway or crossing it, makes a big difference to aircraft performance and presentation. Knowing what the wind is doing relative to the runway in use can help us, the viewers, understand what a pilot is doing as opposed to the wind. But why true rather than magnetic? First, weather reports from your local station and METAR data from your local airport all report winds based on true north. Winds reported over an aircraft radio from ATIS, tower, or ATC are based on magnetic north. Second, we're not flying full scale, listening to ATC or navigating with magnetic bearings, which tower and ATC use to direct traffic. So there it is. Sorry for the long side note. A trip around the pattern will illustrate what I do on a normal approach, with the wind down the runway. As I guide my plane through the pattern, I'm looking at 4 things: airspeed, attitude, altitude, and alignment, in that order of priority. I'll say more about the first 3 when I talk about glide slope. In this video, we're concerned only with the plan view of the pattern and how alignment fits in there. Following standard procedure, I start my landing by entering the pattern on the downwind leg, about 500 feet out from the end of the runway. I throttle back and level off to slow the plane down. At this point, I'm switching to landing mode. Remember, it takes 4 seconds to deploy. Then I drop gear and half flaps. I like to wait until I'm below 40 knots to do this to minimize stress on the servos. A good altitude for my Avanti on downwind is 110 feet, with a final approach distance of no more than 600 feet. Beyond that, the plane becomes too small to read what is happening. Once the plane is established at 30 knots and I'm close to my marker, I begin the 180-degree turn through base to final and start my descent. I usually drop full flaps at the start of this turn, unless there's more than a 10-mile-per-hour wind. Bank angle is kept to 30 degrees or less. Once on final, especially when close to the runway, it's critical to minimize use of the ailerons. Even a small aileron correction can lead to a large shift in alignment, especially in a crosswind. Small rudder inputs, done early and often, are sufficient to correct any drift or misalignment. If doing a touch and go, I immediately raise flaps back to takeoff position when throttling up to go around. I leave the gear down to save wear on the retract servos and try to keep airspeed below 40 knots to save stress on the flap servos. I found it's very easy to blow through 40 knots on climb out if I'm not careful with the throttle. Crosswind landings add another level of difficulty. They can go south in a heartbeat if you let alignment get out of hand. The challenge begins as soon as you enter the downwind leg. Add yaw to keep from drifting too close to the runway. Choose an altitude that will avoid any turbulence from nearby trees. Then slow the plane down as usual. Drop gear and flaps. If the crosswind is really strong, it helps to go farther out than normal. Once the turn to base is made, the plane will accelerate rapidly. It's easy to mistake this for airspeed. Resist throttling back or the plane can stall. Maintain a maximum 30-degree bank all the way through the turn to final. Use rudder to coordinate the turn. More on this in a moment. If you overshoot final, don't be tempted to tighten the turn, except a go-around if necessary. Remember what happened to the Citation. Once on final, keep the wings level while yawing into the wind. Use rudder to remove the yaw as you flare for the touchdown. If doing a touch and go, add the yaw back in after takeoff to stay on centerline. Let's take a minute to look at what a coordinated turn means. In the last video, we saw the danger of an uncoordinated turn in the landing pattern. But what does it mean to coordinate a turn? Full-scale pilots know this phrase very well from basic training, especially during slow flight practice. But they have the advantage of a turn and slip indicator, or the newer variant, the turn coordinator, to keep them in line. And by in line, I don't mean just following instructions, or else. A coordinated turn means keeping the fuselage literally in line with the flow of air outside the aircraft. The more the fuselage is out of alignment with the air, the more side force is generated. Similar to taking a corner too fast in a car. Centripetal acceleration is large because the radius of turn is small. As long as the tires have more grip on the road than we do to our seats, we end up sliding to the side. And if not, oops. As a turn is initiated with ailerons, rudder must be added in the same direction. To remain coordinated through a turn requires balancing the vector components of lift and load. The amount of rudder needed will depend on many factors, including airspeed, the initial roll rate, the angle of bank, aileron setup, and airframe design. All of that can be distilled into maintaining good alignment through the turn so that all of the forces shown here are in balance. The initial reason for misalignment, or adverse yaw, is due in part to our nemesis and friend, induced drag. When banking the wings with ailerons, the down aileron briefly increases the angle of attack, which produces more lift. But as we learned in Part 3, induced drag is inseparable from lift and increases with angle of attack. So when we roll to the right aileron goes up, reducing lift and induced drag, and the left aileron goes down, increasing lift and induced drag. Once the roll rate is established, the lift produced by each wing is the same, so induced drag is the same. Yet adverse yaw continues. It was there from the start due to the effect that rolling has on the local flow of air. The lift vector on the upward moving wing moves back, while the vector on the downward wing moves forward, creating a twisting motion opposite to the turn. This tilt of the lift vectors is the primary source of adverse yaw. Without any correction, the plane will enter a slip to the right. Too much correction will cause a skid to the left. Once the bank angle is established and ailerons are back to neutral, the turn continues with minimal adverse yaw. Only a slight difference in parasitic drag remains due to the outer wing flying slightly faster than the inner wing. In full-scale flight, the pilot simply steps on the ball to correct any slip or skid. If the ball is on the right, the pilot pushes the right rudder pedal to center the ball. Too much right rudder will push the ball left of center, putting the plane into a skid. From our vantage point on the ground, an uncoordinated turn may not always be obvious, but once it's pointed out, you can't miss it. Remember the F-104 Starfighter from the last video? This clip illustrates when an uncoordinated turn is most obvious, when you can clearly see the arc of the turn. Imagine a line from the plane to the center of the turn. The plane should be perpendicular to that line and tangent to the arc. Without right rudder, the nose will be high and in a slip. Too much rudder would put it low and in a skid. Where do you think the ball is in this turn? Accelerating out of slow flight and climbing, the pilot may be continuing to hold a high AOA, which may look like a slip from this view. It doesn't take much rudder to keep the turn coordinated, from a measurable input during slow flight to just breathing on the stick in a high-speed turn. Here's a peek at a control surface position indicator I created in Dashware for the next video on Glideslope, which shows the amount of rudder deflection I used in this turn to final. Don't forget to use rudder when rolling out of a turn, as well as when rolling into it. If you end up too slow anywhere in the pattern, a coordinated turn may save your plane from a stall. Throughout the landing pattern, we need to remain focused on airspeed, attitude, altitude, and alignment. It helps to put these parameters into a mental picture of where the plane should be and what it should look like at any point in the pattern. I will demonstrate what that looks like in practice in Part 5. You can always go around if you're too far off centerline, but if you misjudge airspeed, attitude, or altitude, you may not even make it to the runway. For alignment, keep glancing between the runway, centerline, and your plane to check progress. If you're at a new or unfamiliar airfield, a good tip from Michael Wargo is to simply fly the plane directly at you as you turn onto final. As you approach the beginning of the runway, use rudder to make a gentle turn to line up with the centerline. If the crosswind is strong enough to require excessive rudder, then a side slip may be necessary. The Avanti handles both a forward and side slip without any issue. With a left crosswind, use left aileron and right rudder to stay aligned with the centerline. If using a side slip, remember to keep some aileron into the wind even after touchdown to avoid catching any crosswind. Banking away from a direct crosswind at touchdown can allow the wind to flip your plane over. I was surprised at how fast and violent this was when it happened to me, so be careful. Watch for turbulence from trees when the wind is above 10 miles per hour. Turbulence can toss a model airplane around as easily as wingtip vortices can toss full-scale aircraft. Flying west at 75 feet AGL on downwind puts me about 5 feet below the treetops. The rotors from the tree line on the right extend farther out the stronger the wind is, and on this day, it's gusting to over 20 miles per hour from the right. Let's pause the Avanti there. A strong wind coming over the tops of trees creates rotors and eddies that may flip a model plane over in an instant. Stay well above the trees. Notice how the plane is drifting to the left, closer to the runway. That will make the base leg shorter than it's already going to feel once the turn to base is complete. At that point, the crosswind becomes a tailwind and ground speed will rapidly increase. That will all but guarantee overshooting final. Crabbing into the wind on the downwind leg is just as crucial as crabbing on final. Watch what happens next. The rotors weren't strong enough to flip the Avanti over, but I did overshoot final. Notice how the descent rate got over 400 feet per minute, well above the usual 200. When the wind is down the runway, we don't have to worry about turbulence from this tree line to the south, but once the wind shifts southerly, it can become a problem. As a creature of habit, I have to learn the hard way that new situations require a different approach. In this case, a higher one, until clear of the turbulence. Watch what happens as I fly my normal approach altitude right into this danger zone. I almost bought the farm on this one. I should have stayed above the trees until past the turbulence, as I had warned others to do. This is a good example of how complacency can lead to a crash. Even though circumstances changed with a strong crosswind, I followed the same approach I had done 100 times before. Only this time, it didn't work. That's it for this video. In part 5, I'll cover the glide slope, where all of our skills and attention must be focused to bring our baby home. Until then, keep your wings in the air and your troubles on the ground. And oh yeah, grease one on for me.